The night was thick with silence, the kind that made every creak and groan of the house seem amplified. Martha sat alone in her living room, a small, cozy space with faded furniture and an old rug she'd never bothered to replace. The only source of light was the dim glow from the small lamp on the table next to her, casting long shadows on the walls. She had always liked it this way, quiet, comfortable, and solitary. It was the way she preferred to spend her evenings. The radio on the shelf beside her hummed quietly. It was an old-fashioned piece, a relic from the past with a polished wood finish and brass dials that seemed to resist the march of time. She had inherited it from her grandmother, who had always sworn that it was special. Martha had never quite understood what that meant, but the radio had a nostalgic charm to it, and it provided a certain level of comfort when the house felt too still. She flipped through the dial, searching for something to fill the silence. The usual radio stations came and went, but she wasn't in the mood for music tonight. She was looking for something to keep her company, something that would soothe her mind before bed. But something odd happened. As she turned the dial, the familiar hum of the radio began to distort. Static began to swell, filling the room with a low, crackling sound. At first, she ignored it, used to the occasional interference that seemed to come with such an old radio. But the static lingered. It was louder than usual, filling the room in a way that made her feel strangely uncomfortable. She turned the knob, trying to tune it back to a station, but the static only grew more intense. The crackling noise seemed to echo around the walls of the room, as though the radio wasn't just malfunctioning, it was alive, trying to say something. The lights flickered for a moment, and she rubbed her eyes, thinking it was just a trick of the dim illumination. But then something shifted. From the static, there came a faint sound, a whisper, barely audible, but distinct. It was so soft, so quiet, that at first she wondered if it was just her imagination. She leaned in closer to the radio, her fingers hovering over the dials, trying to adjust the volume. The whisper grew louder, and though she couldn't make out the words, there was something about it that sent a chill down her spine. Her heart rate quickened. She sat back, feeling the hair on the back of her neck stand up. She looked around the room, her eyes scanning every corner, but there was nothing there. Nothing to explain what was happening. She told herself it was just a fluke, an old radio with some sort of electromagnetic interference. But then the whisper came again, clearer this time, though still indistinct. It was calling her name. Martha! Her breath caught in her throat. She stood up, the floorboards creaking under her feet. She walked toward the radio, her pulse pounding in her ears. The whisper echoed in the room, persistent, almost insistent. Martha. It wasn't a trick of the static anymore, she was sure of it. The voice was too real, too close, too familiar. She reached out and tried to turn the dial again, but nothing changed. The static intensified, and the whisper grew louder, now a clear, urgent tone. Her hand shook as she turned the radio off, but the whispering didn't stop. Martha stood there for a moment staring at the darkened radio. The house was so quiet now. Too quiet. The kind of quiet that filled the air with a sense of foreboding. A chill swept through her, and she wrapped her arms around herself as though to ward off the cold, just as she began to convince herself that it had all been a product of her imagination. The radio snapped back on, louder than before, the static filling the room like a dense fog. The whispering voice was gone, replaced by an eerie silence. Martha turned on her heel, intent on walking to the kitchen to get a glass of water to calm her nerves. Her feet moved quickly, but as she passed by the living room window, she froze. There was a figure standing outside in the darkness, just beyond the glass. She couldn't make out any features, only the vague outline of a person, silhouetted by the dim light from the street lamp outside. Her breath caught in her throat, and her heart pounded in her chest. She took a step back, her hand trembling on the edge of the windowsill. The figure didn't move. Martha forced herself to look away, her mind racing with 1,000 thoughts. She reached for her phone on the table nearby, but as her hand hovered over it, the radio crackled again, cutting through her thoughts with a sharp snap. And then it stopped. Complete silence. She gasped, stumbling back in terror, her mind spinning. Her knees buckled, and she fell to the ground. The room seemed to close in on her, the walls pressing in, the shadows growing darker, deeper. The radio clicked off once again, leaving nothing but the unsettling silence that now felt suffocating. And as Martha lay on the floor, her heart racing, she realized that the voice hadn't just been calling her name. It had been warning her. Something was here. Something that had been waiting. Martha could feel her pulse racing in her ears, the blood thumping in her temples as she pushed herself to her feet. The darkness in the room seemed to have thickened, and the weight of the silence pressed heavily on her chest. Her eyes darted across the living room, searching for any sign of movement, any clue as to what had just happened. The voice had been unmistakable, clear in the midst of the static. She had heard it, the sound of her own name, whispered in a voice that was both familiar and foreign. It had sent a chill through her, one that didn't seem to fade with the passage of time. She felt as if her skin were crawling, as though something unseen had touched her, lingering just out of reach. She glanced at the radio again. It sat there innocuously on the shelf, its dial now tuned to an empty channel. The once oppressive static had subsided, but the feeling of unease remained, hanging thick in the air like a fog. Martha forced herself to take a step toward the radio, her legs unsteady beneath her. She reached out, her fingers brushing the cool surface of the radio. She hesitated, the fear of what might happen if she turned it back on almost too much to bear. But she had to know. She needed answers. Her fingers tightened around the knob, and she slowly twisted it. The static returned with a low crackle, filling the room again. But this time, something was different. The static wasn't just noise. It was like the air had become charged, vibrating with an energy that made her skin tingle. And then, in the midst of the crackling, she heard it again. Martha. It was the same voice, soft and distant, but there was a strange urgency to it now. The whisper seemed to echo, bouncing off the walls of the room surrounding her. Her breath caught in her throat and she froze, her hand still on the radio, fingers trembling. Her eyes darted to the window. There was nothing there. No figure standing outside, no movement in the yard, just the empty darkness of the night stretching beyond the glass. She looked back at the radio, her heart pounding in her chest. The voice had been inside the house. She could feel it, the sense that something was creeping around her, drawing closer with each passing second. Martha's thoughts raced, trying to make sense of the situation. She could come up with no logical explanation. The voice had sounded real, too real to be some trick of the static, and it had called her name. There was no mistaking it. Martha. The whisper came again, louder this time, and she instinctively took a step back, her body reacting before her mind could catch up. Her heart was hammering in her chest, and she could feel the blood rushing to her ears, the world around her narrowing to a pinpoint focus. She was aware only of the voice, the static, the way her skin felt prickling under the invisible weight of whatever presence loomed around her. A sudden thought struck her like a bolt of lightning. She turned toward the door, the one to the kitchen. She had shut it moments ago in her panic, but now she needed to open it to escape from whatever was happening here. She needed air. She needed to break free from this suffocating, unseen force. But as she walked toward the door, something caught her attention. Her reflection. In the darkened window beside the door, she saw her own figure staring back at her, slightly distorted, but unmistakable. She was standing still, her shoulders hunched, her hands clenched at her sides. But what unnerved her was that there was something else. a shadow moving in the reflection, something that wasn't quite right. She stopped in her tracks, her heart skipping a beat. She turned slowly, glancing over her shoulder. The room was empty. Her breath came in shallow gasps, and she turned back to the door, her fingers shaking as they hovered over the knob. The shadow had vanished from the window, but the unease had only grown stronger. She knew something was wrong. The atmosphere in the house had changed. She could feel it, an oppressive weight that hung in the air like a storm cloud ready to break. The whisper came again, clearer this time, sharp and filled with an urgency she couldn't ignore. "Martha!" It was not just a voice now. It felt like a presence, like something was trying to get through to her, to reach her in some way. She could hear it vibrating in the walls, the floor beneath her feet. It was as though the very structure of the house was alive, responding to the voice, to the call. Her body froze. Her mind screamed at her to run, to get out of the house, but her feet wouldn't move. It was as if some invisible force was holding her in place, preventing her from escaping. The static had become louder, and the whisper had grown into a guttural growl that sent shivers of dread down her spine. Then there was a shift. The static stopped abruptly, as if someone had flicked a switch. The sudden silence that followed was deafening. The air in the room seemed to grow thick, oppressive, as though the world had stopped moving altogether. It was in that silence that Martha heard it, a sound so close, so intimate, that it seemed to come from within her own body. A whisper, soft and warm against the nape of her neck. "Martha." The voice was no longer coming from the radio. It was behind her. The realization hit her like a punch to the gut. She turned around sharply, but there was no one there. The room was empty, still, silent as it had been before. But she could feel it now, the presence. It was all around her, filling the space with its unseen weight. She could hear it, feel it, in the air around her. The walls seemed to pulse with it. Her eyes darted to the corner of the room, the place where the shadows were thickest. Nothing. Her breath was coming fast now. Panicked, she stepped back, her foot hitting the edge of the coffee table. She stumbled but caught herself, her hands gripping the edge of the table for balance. The whisper came again, louder, more urgent. "Martha." Her body went cold, a shudder running through her as she slowly turned her head toward the radio once more. It sat there, still tuned to static, and yet the room felt alive with a strange energy. The air around her seemed to crackle, charged with the intensity of something unspeakable. She could feel it in the pit of her stomach, like a knot of dread that refused to loosen. And then, as though the radio itself had finally decided to speak, the static cut out completely. Everything went still. Martha's heart was pounding so hard she thought it might break free from her chest. Her breath was shallow, ragged. She stood, frozen, staring at the radio, waiting for something, anything, to happen. A sharp breath, a rustle behind her. And then a voice, close enough now that she could feel the heat of its breath on her skin. Martha. She spun around in a blur of motion, her legs unsteady beneath her. But before she could move, before she could react, the room seemed to tilt, and her world went black. Martha awoke with a start, her breath coming in ragged gasps as though she had been holding it for hours. The room was dimly lit by the flickering light of the lamp, casting long shadows against the walls. Her heart pounded in her chest, and she instinctively reached for her throat as if to check that she could still breathe. It felt like she had been suffocating, trapped in a nightmare from which she couldn't escape. For a moment, she lay there on the floor, still and unmoving, her mind struggling to piece together the fragments of what had just happened. The whispers, the voice calling her name, the presence that had hovered behind her. It all felt like it had been a fevered hallucination, a product of too much stress or too many sleepless nights. But deep down, she knew it wasn't. She sat up slowly, her head spinning as she looked around the room. The radio sat on the shelf, untouched, silent, its dial still tuned to the empty static channel. The air felt heavy, thick with a sense of anticipation, as if the very walls of the house were waiting for something to happen. Martha stood up shakily, her legs unsteady beneath her as she made her way to the window. The night outside was calm, the street lamp casting a pale glow across the yard. She peered into the darkness, her eyes searching for any sign of the figure she had seen earlier, the one standing just beyond the glass. But there was nothing. The yard was empty, the air still. A breath of relief escaped her lips, but it was short-lived. As she turned away from the window, something caught her eye. Her reflection in the glass seemed off. It was subtle at first, just a flicker in the corner of her vision, but as she looked closer, her reflection appeared to shift. It was as though the image of herself had moved without her. Her heart skipped a beat and she stepped back, her eyes wide with fear. The reflection in the window grinned. Martha's breath caught in her throat, her body going cold as she stumbled backward. The reflection, it wasn't hers. The face that stared back at her was distorted, twisted into a grotesque mockery of her own. It grinned wickedly, its eyes dark and hollow, its features contorted into something unnatural. "No!" Martha screamed, her voice ragged and raw, as she spun away from the window. Her heart raced, her mind spinning with disbelief. The room had changed. The walls, the shadows, the very air. Everything felt wrong. The silence had returned, but it wasn't the same. It was suffocating, pressing in on her from all sides. She could hear the faintest whispers, like 1,000 voices murmuring just out of reach. The static from the radio had become a low hum, a constant, persistent sound that seemed to vibrate in her bones. And then, in the dead of night, something shifted. The floorboards creaked behind her. Martha froze, her breath catching in her throat. She turned slowly, her eyes scanning the room. The shadows seemed to move, to stretch and twist like they were alive, writhing in the corners of her vision. The darkness wasn't just a void, it was a presence, something tangible, something that had been waiting. Her heart hammered in her chest as she slowly took a step backward, her foot scraping against the wooden floor. The whispering grew louder, more urgent, and the shadows seemed to grow thicker, closer, until they pressed in around her. And then, from the depths of the room, came the voice. Not from the radio this time, but from somewhere behind her. A soft, mocking tone that sent a wave of terror through her. "Martha." The voice was distorted, like it was being spoken through a filter. 1,000 versions of it layered on top of one another. "You shouldn't have listened." Martha's blood ran cold. She spun around, her eyes scanning the room for any sign of the source. But there was nothing. Just the shadows, the whispers, the oppressive silence that surrounded her. She stepped back, her legs weak, her body trembling with fear. The walls seemed to close in on her, the very air pressing down on her chest as though it was trying to suffocate her. The house felt alive now, alive in a way that was malevolent, hungry. It had been waiting for her, watching her, and now it had her. There was nowhere to run, no way to escape. The very fabric of reality seemed to warp around her, bending and twisting, as though she were caught in the grip of something ancient and powerful. Suddenly, the air shifted, and Martha's world was filled with the deafening sound of static. The radio blared to life once more, louder than ever before, the crackling and hissing noise filling the room with a sound that was almost physical. She covered her ears, trying to block out the noise, but it was as if it was coming from inside her head, pressing into her mind, distorting her thoughts. And then, through the cacophony of static, she heard it again. Martha. The voice was clearer now, as though it had broken free from the static, as though it was no longer hidden beneath the noise. It was closer than before, not coming from the radio, but from somewhere behind her, just out of sight. Martha's breath hitched in her throat, her body frozen in place. She wanted to scream, to run, but her limbs refused to move. The darkness had a grip on her now, and it was tightening, pulling her in. The whispers grew louder, the room spinning as if the very air around her were alive, swirling and twisting like a storm. She could feel it now, the presence, the weight of it, pressing down on her, surrounding her, suffocating her. And then, in the midst of the chaos, the static suddenly stopped. The silence was deafening. The room fell into an eerie calm, as though everything had come to a standstill. Martha stood there, her body trembling, her mind reeling from the overwhelming sense of dread that filled the air. She could feel something staring at her, something lurking in the shadows, something that had been waiting for her to realize its presence. Martha. The voice came again, clearer than ever before, as though it was spoken right next to her ear. She turned, her heart hammering in her chest, and for a split second, she thought she saw a shadow move in the corner of her eye. Before she could react, the door to the kitchen slammed shut with a deafening crash, and the lights flickered wildly, casting the room into intermittent darkness. Her heart skipped a beat as the shadows seemed to stretch, elongating across the floor, creeping closer, like they were coming for her. The air grew thick, with an unnatural heaviness, as though the house itself were alive, its walls closing in, its floorboards groaning with the weight of something far older than the building itself. She tried to move, but her feet felt like they were glued to the floor. Her entire body was frozen, paralyzed by the overwhelming fear that surged through her veins. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the house went completely still. The door to the kitchen stood open now, and the room was bathed in an unsettling silence. The radio, the static, the whispers, all of it had vanished. Martha's breathing slowed, her mind slowly processing the shift in the atmosphere. But she knew it wasn't over. The figure was waiting for her. It had been waiting for so long. And as Martha stepped forward, her footfalls silent on the wooden floor, she knew that she wasn't alone anymore. Something was with her, something that had always been with her. The house had claimed her, and as the door to the kitchen slowly closed behind her, the whispers began again,